Canadian cinema and our relationship with film. My name is Andrew Hunter Scholey, and today we are talking about the Heritage Minutes. Originally produced in 1991, continuing on now, originally produced by the CRB Foundation, and now by the Historica Canada. And we have very special guests on this episode. We have self-proclaimed experts on the Heritage Minutes now. The hosts of the Minute Women podcast. Guys, thank you so much for being here. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Thank you so much for having us. We don't feel like we deserve all of this.
We don't deserve the title of expert
all
in any way.
All the title that you're giving us. I'm Lynnea Swinmer, and I am originally from Lunenburg, Nova Scotia, living here in Halifax now.
And I'm Grace McNutt, and I'm from Sydney and living in Halifax. I do the history side of Minute Women podcast.
I do nothing. I'm here for laughs.
You show up.
I show up. That's what they asked me to do. That's what I do.
But I'm super excited to talk about Heritage Minutes, not from a standpoint of history.
Yeah.
Because I think, we talk about content so much, we don't talk about form. We don't really talk about the way in which they get produced or the cinema side of Heritage Minutes, so I'm excited.
We have Spencer on as a co-host on this episode. I brought Spencer on, number one, because out of the two of us, you're more of a history guy.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm an art history guy.
I'm the person you watch historical films with and I yell at the screen when they're wrong.
Which has happened.
Yeah.
Well, and I was just going to say, because going through history and academia, you're basically told any fiction or media representation on film especially is blacklisted. That is not a good source. Well, and so Heritage Minutes would certainly fall in that category, but I think it's a really interesting jumping off point anyways. But yeah.
And I mean, the other reason why I have Spencer on is that I figured it was only fitting because this has happened because of you.
Aww.
You put the wheels in motion. You got the idea. Why don't you tell the background for this episode?
So, I'm a nerd. First off, that's completely.
You're in good company.
You're in good company.
Yeah. But you know, when you came to me with the idea for this podcast, and you're like, "Hey, what do you want to talk about?" I'm like, if you ever do television, I want to talk about the history minutes, right? Because the heritage minutes to me are they're ubiquitous. Everyone knows them.
Yeah.
And just to know for the background on the show, I've always been open to doing TV shows. I just kind of wanted to get a few episodes under the belt. When I was approaching people, more people wanted to talk about Letterkenny than any other show. People were like, could we talk about Letterkenny?
He's in a Heritage Minute.
He's in a Heritage Minute.
Yeah, Jared Queso.
Yeah, Jared Queso.
Oh, yeah.
He's in a Heritage Minute. Makes you cry.
Oh, he's so good.
Winnipeg Falcons.
It's a new one.
So.
Yeah, he's the coach. He's lost all his friends and their
all
jerseys are hanging on the wall. And,
As we were watching that, the two fingers salute
Yeah,
that
you're
slap over his hand.
jerseys on the wall.
Well, as soon as I heard about this podcast, I'm like, I got to listen to something that isn't just mindlessly American left-leaning politics and get some Canadiana into me.
Yeah.
And I was like, this is right in my wheelhouse. Awesome. Came back and then we just moved. Hunter and I just moved here, and I was like, we don't have the time to do all this stuff. Went back to work, came back, and I was just like, nope, it's happening. I'm just reaching out, just shot in the dark, and hopefully, someone's like, oh yeah, well, we talked with you, and it's like, sweet, okay, awesome, yes, sweet. So it was just
no, we were highly flattered.
It's
because it really is just us.
Yeah,
we've had two guests on, one of which was Julian Richings, who's a wonderful actor. He's the sweetest man in the world, even though he always plays villains.
I truly believe that it is a prerequisite that you have to be a nice, kind human to be in a Heritage Minute.
Yeah.
Because the two people that we've had on are just the loveliest humans. Theodore
Super
Saunders,
sweet.
we also had on. We crossed paths at Acadia University. He was there for theater, and Theodore is now in Toronto working as an actor and doing some different work there. He's doing some playwright work and stuff. And he's just the nicest guy. And he was so happy to be in the Jim Egan episode.
But it's usually us reaching out to people, so we've totally been in that feeling of like, oh
Yeah.
god, it's just a shot in the dark. I'm just DMing like Julian Richings on Twitter.
Yeah.
He'll answer.
Like, Grace and I, yeah, I don't know. I think I can speak for both of us. We're very similar in that this is just a passion, like, pet project, and we honestly, every time we hear that we have like listeners or we like get a piece of fan mail, we like cry a little because it's just like
trying to give it
us.
wholesome. Keep the expectations really
we keep
low.
the expectations really low. So honestly, like, being asked to be here to be on the North and Normal podcast.
But okay, I usually ask people why they picked the movie that they did. Obviously, you guys are on because of the Heritage Minute, so let's just get a little bit of a background about like your show, like the gestation of it, where that came from, because I know doing a podcast about Canadian content as well, I mean, you guys have growing listeners, but it's a very niche thing.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And that's what I find with my show, that for mine, even a lot of Canadians aren't interested in Canadian cinema, so I as well keep my expectations low for a listenership. But it's it's a passion. It's something that I wanted to discuss. So, how did you guys get into the brilliant idea of doing a podcast? Seriously, like as soon as Spencer said it, I'm like, that is such a great idea.
So basically, Grace and I met each other curling. We both realized that we were very like sarcastic and kind of satirical and loved to make fun of other people. And we would, drink together after curling and stuff, but we hadn't really kind of bonded outside of that. Then that fall, I started waitressing, and I was waitressing at a great little restaurant called Auction House in Halifax. And one of my colleagues there, who I became really good friends with, his name's Mark. And Mark runs the podcast production company that we work out of called B&V Media. And one day, Mark and I were just like shooting shit at the bar after work, and I was asking him about his podcast and what he does. And he was just talking about kind of goals that he had in the future. And he's like, I do like some sports stuff, and I have like 20-something-year-old women talking about their problems. He's like, things that I would really like to get into. Things that I would really like to get into are, history, or maybe like comedy, like something funny, or like a history podcast. Like, I think that'd be really cool. And I'm like, dude, I know this girl. I curl with her. She's a history major at SMU. I was like, she's funny. Like, she would be great. Like, you should do a podcast together.
Yeah.
So I like put Grace and Mark kind of in touch.
When I was thinking about like tone of the podcast, it was definitely like, I want the format of the dollop and the tone of My Favorite Murder.
Yeah.
Because ours is far more casual and lighthearted, I think.
So,
but like, you approached me and you
so
were
when I
like,
brought it up to you,
you want to do a history podcast? And I was like, well, I know a podcast with just one person talking is rarely very successful, so you have to do it with me.
and I was like, oh.
And you were like, sure.
I was like, I don't know. So the next week, we come back, we're curling, we curl every week. The next week we come back and Grace is like, so like, I want to do it on Heritage Minutes. Like, I think it would be hilarious. Like, we could be called the Men and Women, like, da-da-da-da. And I was like, I haven't even talked to Mark yet.
Yeah.
I was like, I'm like, why don't you write up a proposal? Grace is like, okay. Next morning, Grace has the proposal emailed to me. I was like, okay.
Well, it's just like, it's just like, you brought it up extremely casually, and I was like, oh yeah, whatever, go home. And I'm like, this is my moment. I have to capitalize on this minute right now. Yeah. And because I'm thinking like, okay, Canadian history, people want like something funny, something really approachable. And I genuinely think, like, I was just sitting down and I was like, oh shit, like, Heritage Minutes are probably the most ubiquitous, like, piece of Canadian historical information that everyone across Canada has had access to. And so it's a great launching off point to be like, this is what they say in the minute, and then research and say either what they got wrong or what they don't talk about, because of course when you have only 60 seconds you can't tell the whole story. So it's like,
we've learned
like what else is there to that person or that event, and it gives you such a wide range of things to talk about. Like, you don't have to be grounded in area, you don't have to be grounded in period. It's like, it jumps from like maple syrup to like civil rights activists.
Yeah.
So,
and I remember it was super funny because Grace was like, do you like know Heritage Minutes? And I immediately just like rattled off like 6. Like,
yeah, it's like, let me tell you all my quotes.
Let me tell you, like, I was like, "Pa ain't gonna make it." I was like, "Molly Johnson, Sir Molly Johnson." I was like, "Acknowledge." And she was like, "Oh, okay, so like Heritage Minutes." And
Well,
I was like,
it is amazing just how part of the consciousness it is, and we'll get into this. But like even leading up to this episode, now that we're allowed to leave our houses, and I'm running into people that casual people that I know that I haven't seen for like the last 4 or 5 months. And they're like, "Oh yeah, small talk," and then they're like, "How's the podcast going? Any new episodes?" And I'm like, "Oh yeah, I'm doing one this weekend about the Heritage Minutes." Same thing.
Yeah.
They're like, "Oh my God, the Heritage." I'm impersonating the guy I ran into yesterday. He's like, "Oh my God, the Heritage Minutes. That's so cool." And then he starts quoting all friends, and it's amazing. Like, I have things to bring up about this later. I think one thing we really should do, because even though we're talking about how this is part of the DNA of every single Canadian, these Heritage Minutes, hypothetically, someone out there listening might not be Canadian.
Right,
I know.
true.
So, I'll be preaching to the choir here, but just really, really quickly, the Heritage Minutes, now put out by Historic Canada, was a concept that was come up with by Charles Bronfman from the Seagrams family, which when I told Spencer that, he thought it was hilarious.
Who says crime doesn't pay?
Yeah.
Right? Anyways, there was a 1986 national survey where, and I don't know why this survey was actually done, but it turned out that less than half of Canadians could identify our first prime minister, and 1/4 could name an event or an achievement of which they were proud.
Yeah.
So Bronfman decides that he is going to piece together these 1-minute, really historical ads, for lack of a better term, that are filmed. They're just really quick little snippets of Canadian history, as you mentioned. They just run a variety of topics.
They run the gamut.
All of them, just randomness. And for us Canadians, it's really is our entryway. Like every Canadian talks about how we don't get taught Canadian history. My mom goes on about how she wasn't taught Canadian history.
Oh, yeah.
She just goes, they talk about bloody Champlain going down the river, that was it.
That's it.
And and I grew up knowing like much more American history than Canadian history. And what Canadian history I knew was from these shorts. Like so sorry, just to really quickly run down, like they were produced in English and French starting in 1991. I'm most familiar with that first block that they did between 1991 to 2000, and going back to rewatch them, I was not familiar with the ones that
that's the bread and butter. That's like what people grew up on. Like those were the first ones.
And now I feel like it's far more of like an online rollout. Like they do get aired, but it's more of like digital media, and it's kind of funny because in some ways they're before their time in the sense of like, oh, you have a short attention span, give me 60 seconds of your time and I'll tell you about Jim Egan, LGBTQ rights activist.
You couldn't escape them. They would run on all different networks. Because basically the deal was they could show these minutes and it would take up some of their Canadian content time. Because in Canada, every single network has to have a certain percentage of programming
the same as radio stations.
Canadian. I jokingly said yesterday that it's like, it's almost like, if we show like 30 of these in a day, we can put on a half-hour show that somebody actually wants to see.
Yeah.
And that was kind of the deal. And I remember this.
That's hilarious.
In 1992, they actually would show them before movies. And I remember that as a kid going and seeing Heritage Minutes. And we'll get into specific ones later and which ones kind of stick with us.
Yeah.
But, and you would rent a video from Blockbuster and they would be before in the previews. Like for a while there during that, as you said, the golden era between 1992 and,
like
1991 and 2000-ish. You couldn't escape them.
No, and it's something that like bringing up like talking about American history, and that I feel like that's what you're, even as Canadian, you're more familiar with. I think Heritage Minutes as a piece of medium are something that is so authentically Canadian. It's something you like. You leave the country and you're like, oh, you're Canadian, beavers, maple syrup, blah 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 blah. But if you go outside the country and you're like Heritage Minutes, they're like, that I do not know what you're talking about, but every Canadian knows what you're talking about. Like, it's something that's very genuine and authentically Canadian, I think.
I try to think of something ubiquitously Canadian. We're using ubiquitous so much.
I use that word so much, I'm sorry.
It's like, what do? We take off our shoes when we enter a house. And we, like, know the Heritage Minutes. Like, that really struck, like, doesn't matter where you go. I've lived in almost every province at some point, stayed in every province for like more than a month. And it doesn't matter where you go. Everywhere.
It resonates more than other stereotypes.
So where to go from here? That's the background.
How did you two get exposed to these?
Because that was a big question mark. I had to, because I'm older. And as I said, I was watching these in the early 90s, and I was like, oh, well, everybody got exposure to these, and I'm like, well, if you're coming at these post-2000, like, would they be common?
So I'm born in 96.
And I'm born in 94. And to be completely honest, I didn't have cable as a kid.
Same.
And so we had like the 2 channels that you could get on TV. The TV was for movies
3.
only.
Bougie.
I think we got like 2 or 3, but you had to twist the dial, and like we had rabbit ears.
CTV, CBC, Global.
Yeah, so I think that's
they're
what I
on
had.
all of those networks,
Yeah.
like you said. And so
I just wasn't aware if they were still airing.
Yeah.
Because
they still aired for sure.
I haven't had cable since the late 90s.
Yeah.
No, and
So I just didn't see them. That's why, when we were talking before, like I hadn't seen any of the ones post 2000.
And they do still air on CBC, the new ones. Like one just came out about
The Liberation of
D-Day,
Holland.
or the Liberation of Holland.
Yeah.
And that one came out, and that one has aired on CTV. It's also on like CTV Gemini. Like you have to see commercials if you watch CTV Gemini, and those come on as the commercials.
Like CBC's streaming.
Yeah, like
Okay.
CBC streaming service.
Yeah.
If you're on YouTube and doing stuff,
But they
they'll come
were
up with
definitely
those ads.
on. Like, I can remember watching American Idol, and then in the ads, there would be a Heritage Minute. And, like, it is really interesting watching them as kids because, as we talk about on the podcast a lot, we were like, do you remember that Heritage Minute? Some of them I don't remember.
Yeah.
I don't know if there is a regionality to how they get aired. Like, do they try to air them in a way that is more relevant to your region?
Yeah. And
I don't know if that's true. Because, like, for me, I was like, I don't remember any of these prairie ones.
No.
But Halifax Explosion, I saw every day.
Every day.
Oh, the Halifax Explosion one was showing a lot. I think
It's
there were just
everyone's
more
favorite.
popular ones that they were showing. Because when we did our rewatch, because I don't remember if I actually said this on podcast, Spencer and I a couple of weeks ago grabbed some beers and just sat down and watched them all like a movie.
Yeah.
Because there's 90 of them.
Yeah.
Hour and a half. So that's what we did. And it was funny, like I said, those later ones I hadn't seen, but the earlier ones, I'd be like, have I seen this one? And then somebody would say something, I'm like, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I've seen that one.
Like, most of them were like that. Like, some of them are ingrained in my brain. Like the Joe Shuster Superman one, the Halifax Explosion, the Underground Railroad one was showing a lot.
Nitro, where it's like...
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. The seizure. Dr. Penfield. I smell
But so many of them, like you brought up the Irish Orphans one.
Yeah.
And I'm like, have I seen this one? It's like, what's your name? It's like, what did you say?
Molly Johnson.
Molly Johnson. And I'm like, oh my god, yes, this one.
Please let us keep our Irish name. Mama wanted us to keep our Irish names.
Which is, I think, an interesting one because I think it's one of the only ones where it's actually bilingual.
Yeah.
Because you have people singing English and French in it.
Yeah.
And
Which
it has
they always
subtitles.
get aired with either dubbing or subbing of subtitles. But like,
Again, as we kind of discussed before the podcast started, we were kind of sharing a little bit about background information. The Irish Orphans Heritage Minute actually came out during a time where the rest of Canada was trying to keep Quebec happy.
super happy.
And so that episode, I feel like that might have something to do with it.
Yeah.
Because the real story kind of behind the Irish Orphans was that it was an immigration issue and a lot of people died because they were stuck on boats
Due to
for
bureaucracy, a lot of people
ages
died.
in water. And so there were
which
a
is
lot of
not a great
orphans. Not a great Canadian moment, but seeing how the Quebecois adopted these poor Irish orphans and let them keep their Irish names, goddamn, is really touching for Canadian history.
Well, there's 3 points I want to bring up. First off, being from the prairies, I never saw any of the prairie ones. That
Interesting.
Louis Riel one is awesome.
Yeah.
That
It's
slaps
terrifying.
So hard.
It
I
slaps,
slapped
but
so
no,
hard.
it's
Scary.
terrifying.
I didn't see that until we watched that. I was like,
I think it's almost too graphic for them to show on
But
TV. Like,
the
they
Sitting Bull
hang
one.
a dude on
They
TV.
hang a dude.
I never like the Sitting Bull one.
yeah.
The only one that comes close is like Sam Steele, but that's the Yukon.
I'm an American.
I'm an American. Yeah.
He
Finger
could have
gun.
just like military pressed him and threw him off a cliff, but he didn't, thankfully. Yeah, it's interesting the political bent that these have. Because I made a list of ones that I'm like, why weren't these made? Then I'm like, oh, politics.
Yeah.
100% politics.
Yeah.
And I'm not surprised at all that it's like, making like
And
one...
did you say, sorry, ones that haven't been made or ones that were made?
No, that haven't been made. I have a list of
Yeah.
ones that haven't been made, and I'm like, why not? This is huge.
Oh yeah,
This
we
is,
have a list
like,
of ones that we think should be
It's
mixed.
like, why not? And I'm like, oh.
Yeah, we're definitely getting into that. I think everybody has a list. Well, and that's what really struck me as well when we watched them, is that the later ones, specifically the post-2000 ones, started addressing some touchier
Exactly.
areas of
Yeah,
Canadian
sure.
history, like, oh yeah, we were great to our indigenous population.
Yeah.
And
You
then
know,
they're
and
like,
actually addressing those things. And
Yeah.
that's what I find interesting. And I wonder if that's because they start showing them more online and less running as ads, maybe?
yeah.
Well, and I
Or
think,
is it just us as a culture, we've
I
just
think
evolved?
Canada started to get a little more
Yeah.
woke.
Because I
And,
think so, like wokeness for early '90s was like an emphasis on women's history.
Yeah. For
So
sure.
you have like the Jenny Trout Heritage Minutes, like first female doctor. You have a whole heritage minute about midwifery.
Emily Carr.
Which like midwifery is
Billy
not
McClung.
Canadian,
Yeah.
but
The school teacher as well.
school
Yeah.
The world
Yeah.
school teacher,
which
yeah.
is a super interesting one
There's
because
a
it's
lot.
about a painting and a person.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
really
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, and I mean the midwifery one. We haven't covered that one on the podcast yet.
I think it's the one we reference the most.
We
without
reference it all
bringing
the
up.
time because that one just like as
God,
a
that girl is
child, I'm
annoying
like,
as
why
fuck.
is that girl being such a little bitch?
Well, she's like, oh, I already did this walk once.
She's
I'm
like,
gonna do it
I'm
again."
so tired.
My mom's gonna die. It's like, shut up.
It's like,
This brings me to my point. I mean, I find it's kind of hard to have favorite heritage minutes
oh yeah,
because they're just so, like I said, baked into us.
Yeah.
But I guess the best way, like, how do you guys decide which ones you do on your show? And are there any that you, because I get asked this about my show, are there any that you don't want to do? Or are there any that you really, really like and you're putting off?
So,
Like, for
like,
example,
yeah.
I haven't done, my
Yeah.
favorite film of all time is a Canadian film.
okay.
And I have not done it on this
Okay. Are you
podcast
Are you gonna
yet.
tell us what
Are you
it
gonna-
is?
Yeah, it's Last Night by Don Mclaughlin.
Okay. Interesting.
I absolutely adore it.
And which one won't you do, Hunter?
The movie I will never do is fucking Porky's. That fucking sexist, misogynist piece of problematic crap.
Trash.
At one point, the highest grossing Canadian film of all time. I
For a
will bitch
while.
about Porky's when it comes up, but I
Yeah.
will never devote an entire episode to it.
Yeah.
So, like,
yeah, for
I-
us, I can't answer this because
Yeah.
I do nothing. I will say this time and time again on our podcast. I will say it time and time again here. I
Everywhere.
just show up.
I just yeah. I
my
pick
job.
all the episodes. Like Mark really has no influence either. Like I pick all the episodes in advance. Sometimes it's timely. So we had Black Lives Matter happen, and I was like, okay, we have to do Viola Desmond. Like it's
So-
really the only Black activist one
with
that
everything going
has
on
been
with George
created.
Floyd's murder, and
Um,
we really felt that was important. We took a week off the podcast, and then we came back immediately
And
with
did
the
that one.
episode on Viola Desmond.
It was Pride Month last month, so that's why we did Jim Keegan.
Yeah.
Ones that I'm looking forward to do. So like Halifax Explosion. A, we live in Halifax.
Yeah.
B, it's the one that people ask about the most. They're like, when are you gonna do it? When are you gonna do it? Not
The
that
more
we
you
get that
ask,
many
the longer
people.
you're gonna have to.
But I
wait.
feel like there's pressure to do that one, right?
yeah,
'Cause
and
it's
do it justice.
Do it justice. It's a great heritage minute. Also, people kind of know the story of
Yeah.
the Halifax explosion, or maybe that's just me being here.
I was
and,
also
like,
in the
knowing
movie.
that. You were in the movie about the
Kind of a big
Halifax
deal.
explosion. Your credit.
When I was 9 years old.
Yeah. But ones that like are. There's never been one that I'm like, we won't do it. Like, we will do every Heritage Minute.
Yeah.
But there are ones that I know we can't laugh at. So, like,
Yeah.
Channy Wenjack
Yeah.
is the most recent one about Indigenous history in in Canada, and it's about a boy who runs away from a residential school and dies of exposure due to running away. And it was really the first way that white people were introduced to, oh wow, is like really terrible system that we've been enforcing throughout.
And we talk
history.
about it a lot on our podcast that we are two young white women, and we very much, we recognize that we have that privilege and that point of view. And so for us, it really is like education for us in a lot of cases. So there are some podcasts or some heritage minutes rather that I know that Grace and I've kind of talked about that. We're gonna have to be serious. It's how do you approach this? What is the best way to talk about this?
Yeah, like it's easy to laugh at basketball.
Yeah.
You can't laugh.
It's easy to laugh at white dudes playing a game called Duck on a Rock.
It's easy to laugh at like Sir John A. Macdonald. Like even though he went through stuff, he's still a guy that you can be like, what a weirdo.
You kind of gotta roast him at the end of it.
Absolutely.
That's the thing. It's
You
just like,
shred him.
like Yeah, like stuff happened. Brother violently murdered by their butler. Nobody seemed to really care.
Well, after being forced to gin, like...
Yeah,
like, please get drunk.
I really appreciate that because I think that's another similarity between our two shows. Like, when I did, Strange Brew, the Bob and Doug McKenzie movie with James, and recently recorded Black Christmas with James, it'll be very different when we tackle, like, a Denis Villeneuve, Denis Arcand, doing an episode on, like, Polytechnique, if somebody wanted to talk about Polytechnique. Like, that'll just be a heavy episode, but I do want to take all these things on, so I do really appreciate the sort of different amounts of respect and tone that you have to do. And
I think we advertise ourselves as like a comedy history podcast. Like, we don't advertise ourselves as this super serious, deeply in-depth research podcast, but I think that there are certain Heritage Minutes, especially ones that were more recently done, that require that tone, and then there are also ones that have been done in the past, like the Sitting Bull one, that present that person and the event that it talks about in a way that probably wouldn't be appropriate today.
Exactly. I mean, one that comes to mind for me is workers from China on the railroad.
Yeah.
If that episode was done today, it would be done differently.
Yeah,
but this episode,
let's emphasize
there is a weird comedic beat to that one.
There is that one and the Underground Railway one. Like, I find that both of those aren't.
It's white people saving.
It's white people saving
The
these
day.
people, and then in the end, these people of different minorities, of different cultures in Canada, just being super appreciative to these white people.
Yeah.
And as we know,
that's always the way it went.
That's not really
even the Jackie Robinson
true.
one.
Oh yeah.
Like, that's one that people really love.
Yeah.
It's like, I think there was a poll done of like favorite Heritage Minutes.
Yeah, it's
Jackie Robinson is 2.
Yeah.
I think Halifax Explosion was 1. Or maybe I read a different one.
The source that I had said Jackie Robinson was actually 1, which surprised me. Halifax Explosion is 2, Jenny Trout is 3, with Winnie being 4 and Laura Secord being 5.
That was the interesting one.
Because the Laura Secord one to me was like, what the hell?
But I also think that
the first one they did. That's the very first one.
And so I think that one was aired a lot.
Yeah.
And so people remember it. And so I don't know, like, sometimes we pick favorites by ones we remember.
Well, and also it introduced a generation that Laura Secord wasn't just chocolate.
Exactly.
And I think that the name recognition goes a long way.
Yeah.
With okay, so I don't know, you've probably come across this before, and I just thought this would be an interesting exercise and a way to talk about the minutes. When they started out the minutes, there were 6 pieces of criteria that the Heritage Minutes had to fall into. Have you seen this before?
No, I haven't.
No.
So I just figured that each of these bits of criteria, it would be interesting just to use that as a sort of jumping point to talk about whether or not these minutes generally fit the criteria, if they succeed with them. So the first criteria was to intrigue us with Canadian history.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think they do a good job of that for the most part. Like, and I don't know if that's more due to the content or if it's more due to the form, because I do think about them and like there is this nostalgia I have for those really like early ones that are like this hazy filter.
It's so weird.
Like,
the Laura Secord, it's that early 90s, the Laura Secord one, the Dr. Penfield one. They have this weird, they have this weird like, let's try out some really nifty camera tricks, guys.
Yeah.
Like, let's make these cool.
Like Jacques Plum when he gets hit in the face.
It's
with
the camera's
puck.
on
the camera
the puck.
is the puck, right? So,
and the Dr. Penfield one when she like falls to the ground and it's like all this like stop kind of motion like weirdness.
And we're actually going into the second one, which is PE producible within resources.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I mean actually
And they do get pretty inventive.
Oh yeah.
I mean, there's a one that you hate, Vikings.
Vikings is a weird one.
But they're trying some weird stuff.
I don't know
there.
why that's a thing.
That is like a cutscene from like a shitty like 3rd generation console that came out in like 97. It's just like Vikings.
Yeah.
But like I said, like you said with the puck though, like I can picture some young directors
There's
going
early
in there
CGI
being like,
in some of them. Like,
the Peace Tree.
Yeah.
One or whatever. Where it's just like
I don't remember the name, but
just like brutal siege, like reboot.
they're trying.
No, but
young
reboot
Canadian
is gold by
directors.
comparison.
I'm reminded of like old BBC shows like Doctor Who, you know, like it's what you use within your resources. And then there's some of the later ones. That Kensington Market one is beautiful.
It's gorgeous. Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, it's fully animated.
You know, we've talked about our backgrounds. I'm a Torontonian. Like I'm from Ontario originally, and I remember, going down into, Kensington Market for Jamaican patty on cocoa bread. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like that sort of cool area. And not to mention, speaking of favorite things, like one of my favorite TV shows of all time takes place in Kensington Market, which is Twitch City, which was a Canadian TV show from the 90s. But like I said, like the production, and I think that also goes because they slow down production as well. Like they release a couple every few years.
Yeah, now it's way less regular. Like they said they wanted to have 100 by 2021 when we spoke with them. So that would mean like maybe 5 a year.
Yeah.
But yeah, like speaking with Julian Riching when we interviewed him, he was like, yeah, in the 90s it's a commercial crew. Like the crew that
was
does
really
the minute that ads is what they film. So
they're
it's
good, and
very
it's
efficient. Very like
it was done that way because they had to be a minute. It's like get in, get out. Like they know how to do that because they're commercial directors.
Yeah, exactly. So
yeah.
It was like that was a really interesting perspective to get on early production.
Whereas when we talked to Theo, it was
casting process was so
huge
long.
casting process.
Yeah.
He spent several times in a casting studio trying to get like the look right and the feel right and getting callbacks, and then like on the actual set and doing the actual scenes. It was so much more of an in-depth process.
Yeah. So I don't know if they have a bigger budget.
Dad, I got the Heritage minute.
Yeah,
like it was like a big
Dad's
deal.
Because it is.
I think it is. I think there is prestige with them
Yeah.
now, and so I don't know if they have a bigger budget simply because they're trying to roll out fewer, or if it is like the kind of reputation of them has increased to the point that there is a bit more like.
Well, it has
budgeting towards
longevity.
them. Yeah.
And now that it is part of the cultural consciousness, like in ways certain things aren't, like even Canadian TV shows like the Beachcombers, no, but they just kind of fall to the wayside. But Heritage Minutes have stuck around in a way like a lot of Canadian media hasn't.
Grace raised an interesting point there, because I wonder if the 90s was like austerity for the Canadian government. We were running a huge deficit after the Mulroney years, and it continued well into the 90s. Everything was getting cut, and maybe they're just like, you know what, fuck it. Just this guy's going to do it? Sweet, bring him in, we'll just do it. Whereas now it's like we have some kind of semblance of fiscal security at a government level. They're like,
and standard.
Right? So it's like we have a standard, we have the money to maintain that standard.
Yeah.
Maybe that's something, because I mean there's an ebb and flow to everything in the federal government.
It's interesting because they are outsourced, right? Like Historic Canada is not a department of the government, nor was the previous foundation that produced them.
Yeah.
So they're not private, they're NGOs.
Yeah.
But like I wonder if it does have something to do with what money is poured into arts and culture, which I think now there's probably more pressure. But certainly I think you have to have more of a reason to make them. Like, I think about certain minutes that I'm like, it's good. I don't think it would have been made today.
Yeah.
Particularly ones about, like, cool white guys.
Yeah.
Like Joseph Bombardier. It's cool. It's a great minute.
Yeah.
I've been to the museum. It's great.
Yeah.
I don't know if it would be a heritage minute though.
Or I don't know if it would have been done the way that it was if it was done today.
Yeah. Or like we did Marconi.
Yeah.
Like Marconi's story is great, but like he's not Canadian.
No.
He did the Telegraph in Newfoundland before it was part of Canada.
They don't even really know if it actually worked.
So it's just like.
That's a talking point later, and we brought that up before the show.
Yeah.
Like the ones that are very tangentially Canadian,
right?
And I brought up particularly the basketball one, which basketball was, I don't believe was not invented in Canada. It just happened to be a Canadian who's credited with it.
Yeah.
And the Joe Shuster one. And me being a comic nerd, that's a stickler one for me because, Joe Shuster's family moved to Cleveland. Like, he was from Toronto, moved to Cleveland when he was really young. And he would go back and visit Toronto, every summer. To visit his cousin Frank, who was still in Toronto. The pulps that influenced Superman, the wrestlers that influenced Superman, like all these sort of different factors are not really a Canadian source.
Yeah.
It's just tangentially he happened to.
And I believe in the Superman one, they like have to like weasel in how this is Canadian somehow. Like the woman he's talking to named Lois, she's just like, you Canadians.
Yeah.
Or yeah, whatever.
Yeah.
It's like it must be because you're Canadian.
Okay.
Yeah. So
It is
there's just one
strange.
thing that I wanted to bring up about funding before we get onto the non-Canadianness of that. I found a lot of the new ones are bankrolled not by the federal government like the CRB ones were, but are bankrolled in part also by provinces.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Because Acadia, I believe, the Acadian one was Nova Scotia. I might be wrong on that, but for sure the North New Brunswick regiment, the D-Day one.
Yeah.
At the end, it's like ACTRA because okay, respect, and then underneath that it's like province of New Brunswick.
Okay,
So it's like that's why they're like, and no, some of these boys had never left the North Shore, and you're like, North Shore, hey? I wonder.
So
That was a really good East Atlantic accent.
I was going for like the old timey like newscaster being
That's
like,
that's
"Oh, go get 'em, boys! Watch out, Mr. Hitler, we're coming for you!"
Transatlantic.
The trans-
yeah, exactly.
Is it? Yeah, I forget
What's
what
the
it's
third
called.
criteria?
Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say we've already started leading into this one, but I find this funny that this was actually one of the criteria. Be truthful within the bounds of dramatic license.
Oh my god. So the first history course I ever took in university was a film called History Goes to the Movies. And it was a brilliant course, and it was designed as a way to like, how do you use fiction as pieces of historical documentation, typically with the idea that it's not about what they're talking about, it's about when it was made and why are they deciding to talk about it. And the first exercise we ever had to do was we watched the trailer for Lincoln because it had just come out, and then we watched the trailer for Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter, and the professor was like, essentially I'm going to argue that Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter is a better historical film because it doesn't sell as truth.
Yeah.
Like, you know it's fake.
Fair enough.
So any nugget of truth that you can take from it or that they can weasel into it is actually really great. Versus Lincoln, which is trying to tell, like, not that it's necessarily its purpose, but if you went in naively, you would be like, oh, this is the story of Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah.
And so I think Heritage Minutes kind of fall into that same trap of, like, the context is that this is 100% truthful, but there has to be some kind of license for dramatization and making it interesting. And so, like, we talk about, like, it's not necessarily a criticism of Heritage Minutes, but it's like when you only have a minute, you really can't get into why someone might be offended that you're talking about, like, Nellie McClung, for example. Like,
For sure.
you definitely can't talk about everything.
Oh, Nelly.
Oh,
Like,
Nellie.
between Nellie McClung and like Marconi, you have two great examples of it's like, but wait,
a dude who was a huge fascist.
It gets worse.
The biggest.
yeah, worked for the signals of the Italian like
Chills with Mussolini.
Yeah.
Like, I was researching that one, and I was just like, oh, this is gonna be a good episode.
Oh, those fascists, they'll get you.
Well, they have to get you for sure.
They sneak up on you.
Okay, so number 4 is also a fun one. Reflect and celebrate Canadian social and cultural values. Tolerance, fairness, courage, tenacity, resourcefulness, and inventiveness.
Resourcefulness. I think inventiveness is definitely one that gets put out a lot because it's easy in the sense of like, oh, you have an inventor, which is why I'm always surprised by like Alexander Graham Bell doesn't have a Heritage Minute, which I understand, like, his invention of the telephone is kind of controversial, but it's like the first flight in British North America is Alexander Graham Bell.
Yeah.
But you do make one about Marconi.
Yeah.
Like, it's just a strange process. Like, who gets one and who doesn't.
There are...
And then some of them is just like what's lying around, and you have that with the Avro Arrow episode and the Grey Owl episode, where it's like
we have
well,
a
there's
film.
already a movie made on this.
Let's just
Might
like
as well cut it up and
cut
make
clips
it into.
of Pierce Brosnan,
Yeah.
and we
It's still our goal to get him on the podcast.
Yeah,
That's our unattainable goal, is
That's
to
our
get Pierce
unattainable
Brosnan.
plan.
I can tell you this right now, Dan
Like,
Aykroyd
notice
would probably
me.
be on your podcast. That guy will go on anything.
Who will?
Dan Aykroyd.
Dan-
If you reach out to Dan Aykroyd for the Avro
Is he
Arrow
in here?
episode,
Oh, right, he's
Yeah.
in
well,
there.
because that's from a made-for-Canadian TV movie.
Right,
Miniseries
right,
called the
Yeah, we're
Avro Arrow.
also currently working on the guy from Republic of Doyle,
Alan Hawke.
Alan Hawkeye, because he's
Hawko.
in Hawko.
Hawkeye.
Okay.
Wrong guy.
Anyways.
Alan Hawko, if you're listening,
Hi.
we really want you to come on our podcast. Yeah, he's in one about veterans and like Veterans Affairs and how
Oh, the one in
he's got his face blown off.
yeah, which is awesome that they got him because that airman was actually Newfoundlander, so technically
that's
not
wicked.
Canadian.
Yeah.
Despite taking place in Vancouver, he wasn't a member of like the Canadian Air Force. He was part of the RAF. Not
And it's all
the RAF.
dramatic. He's like
World War
standing
I or World
there.
War II?
World War II.
Okay.
And he's all like standing there, and then they're like,
The turn.
"Why do
It's
you?"
literally
and he does
Two-Face,
the
like-
turn,
Yeah.
and he's like, "Because I was there." I was there.
Yeah.
So 5 is kind of boring. Reveal origins. I that's kind of a weird one. I think it's more or less just do your job.
Sorry, wait. Can we get back to
But that's
the
not
fourth one for a
true.
second? Because the fourth
Yeah.
They
one.
don't do that.
They don't do that.
They
really.
hardly reveal origins ever.
ever. Yeah.
And like my beef with one before that too is like these Canadian values. Where the fuck did they get those from? Did they just pluck out good like buzzwords and be like, haha,
Tolerance.
yeah, tolerance, yeah.
Like, can we just
These
talk
came-
about?
some of these came out when there were still residential schools and they're talking about
Yeah.
tolerance.
Can we
Yeah.
just talk about
You know?
the flag episode and how that has literally like that whole episode? I don't think has any of those values.
Origin.
It's origins.
Yeah.
I guess.
Well, and just to round out, because we're already talking about it, the 6th one was surprise, provoke, reflection, re-examination, and raise questions.
They raise a lot of questions.
They're also doing, I would say, like the re-examination. When did that come out?
Is that the original or is that?
I
Like,
believe it's the
new?
original criteria,
Because
like when
that
they were
is-
originally approaching
yeah,
people
okay.
to do it. But I just thought it was a good way to kind of contextualize the short to talk about it.
I do think a lot of those points, you can pick pieces. I would say, like, if I was doing a rubric on every Heritage Minute, I would say that they would at least pass
Yeah. Yeah. If
that criteria.
Yeah.
is there like they have to meet all of these criteria, or it's like
Or that's
2
just
out of
like,
6?
Yeah, 2 out of
Yeah,
6
let's
kid.
pass here, yeah.
Because I do think the ones that are really well done and the ones that have longevity are usually biographies.
Yeah.
Usually about a person, not a thing or an event. So like they chose Halifax explosion, but they chose to do Vince Coleman, not
Yeah.
the explosion. And I think that's really, really successful because you get this person's like moment of heroism.
Yeah.
Same with like Andrew Minarski, which is like
Oh.
an episode I really love to do because it's such like, it's so crushing to
It
hear
was.
his story.
That was the first episode where I just felt like gutted. Like,
Jack.
I was so sad.
Might I say about that episode? What at the end when you touched on the fact it's like Minarski got the VC because his officer survived.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Is 100% true of like all of that, and it gets into like a larger Canadian political thing.
Yeah.
Like side tangent I have to that is that like I know plenty of stories of what went on in Afghanistan that there were no Victoria Crosses for.
Yeah.
We were the only Commonwealth country that
Yeah.
didn't hand out a Victoria Cross.
Right.
And like just based on the stories that I've heard, it's like, why not? It's like, oh well, that's a political thing. Why would you want to bring attention to this? And it's like that's something underlying in all of Canada. It's like for how little the average Canadian knows about Canadian politics, how much emphasis we put
Yeah.
onto Canadian politics
Yeah.
and everything that we do.
Yeah, and from coming from an academia standpoint, when you cross over with public funding, there's this really tricky situation where if you're doing any kind of public commemoration, you want that person to be dead because they can't go on and do something weird afterwards.
Or
Like
tarnish it, yeah.
if you're commemorating someone who's still living, so
Yeah.
like I think about like Wayne Gretzky could easily have a Heritage Minute. Like he's widely recognized as the greatest hockey player of all time. It's our national
a great
sport.
one, yeah.
Blah 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 blah. But if he goes off and has a like extramarital affair tomorrow and then says some really stupid shit on Twitter,
Supports the Conservative Party.
yeah, like he's like I endorse Trump,
Yeah.
like does some like something like that, then you've already produced something that's trying to make them a hero or at least trying to present
Yeah.
them in the best positive light.
Yeah.
And then it becomes uncomfortable, and
Yeah.
people don't want history to be uncomfortable, especially from a public funding standpoint.
Exactly.
Holy shit,
So, like, it's easy to make Heritage Minutes about people who are dead.
Yeah.
And so, Andrew Minarski, in this situation, I don't know if Pat Brophy was alive. He probably wasn't when that Heritage Minute came out in 2005. But it is one of those things of, like, commemorating dead people is safer in
Yeah.
terms of public funding. So, I think that probably goes a long way also in deciding who gets a minute.
That's a very interesting point of view that I never even considered.
Yeah.
So I'm glad
We-
now
we
that
talked a lot about
when we
that.
get to what Heritage Minutes we would like to have made, I'm glad mine doesn't fall into that.
Yeah, okay,
And so I'm
perfect.
still safe. I don't have to reconsider
yeah.
last second.
Yeah.
Really want to touch base on criticisms
Yeah.
of the Heritage Minutes. I don't remember if we talked about it on episode or not. The Louis Riel episode was criticized for violence. We did cite that, at least Spencer and I, when we were younger. That's one, I'm pretty sure I did see that on television, but it's not one as commonly done. Quickly, if anybody hasn't seen it, it's basically, if I remember correctly, Louis Riel reciting a monologue, and then at the end you realize that his neck is in a noose and they just drop him.
Yeah. So it's his hanging. Yeah.
Yeah. And it doesn't really contextualize much of it.
No.
It's very much like, I wanted freedom for my people, but also a Lord's Prayer. Like, there are certain ones that are very religious that I don't think would have been made today.
Well, that's the thing with Louis Riel is that, like, Manitoba, obviously, is like, he's the father of Manitoba.
Yeah.
Big deal. Like, huge deal. This was someone who was like, yeah, sweet, I'm going to fight for the rights of my people, for, like, hunting rights, land rights, and then establish a Roman Catholic theocracy in the middle of North America. And it's like, you know, you really had me.
And also, I believe I'm a prophet.
Yeah, I literally believe that, like, I'm going to, like, bring about, like some Catholic idea of justice on earth. And it's like, cool. You had me right up until that last point, you know?
Well, that's a funny point about Canadian history. Like, despite the Heritage Minute, I really had no idea who Louis Riel was until Chester Brown's book, Louis Riel, and reading that and being like, oh, so this is what his deal was. Like, I knew of the name.
Yeah.
But, you know, when Chester Brown decided to release this, like, comic biography of Louis Riel, I mean, it's great.
Yeah. When I saw the Louis Riel Heritage Minute, that's kind of like all I knew. Like, I remember learning about Louis Riel in, like, grade 9 social studies or whatever, and then not really hearing about Louis Riel again. Like, I didn't even know. Like, I just thought he was, like, another white dude in history.
Yeah, and
like,
I mean,
really, you don't. It's really just on the east coast of Canada. I didn't hear very much about. Louis
But
Riel.
I mean, I just finished my master's thesis on Indigenous affairs in Nova Scotia, and Louis Riel and Northwest Rebellions goes a long way to determining the way in which Indigenous affairs gets rolled out everywhere, and how much budget is spent on calm places like Nova Scotia. So it is something that I think is really important. But I would say, like, that's one of the Heritage Minutes it's very provocative.
Yeah.
But also doesn't do a great job of explaining what it's about.
It's just kind of like, what?
Yeah.
Oh, he's dead.
Cool. Chill.
And obviously then you could see why it maybe doesn't get shown as much as some of the others. It has also drawn criticism for...
Well, if I could just take this second to say, it was also like Louis Riel's executed on what's essentially trumped up charges.
Yeah.
Right, like there's a whole other dimension to it where it's like, this is a gross injustice, but it's a complexity of history where you can't, it's hard to idolize people, even the dead. You know, and that's still happening in this minute, is that we have someone who is an idol that we put on a stand, and it's like, you know what, maybe we just shouldn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There has been criticism that they focus too much on military achievements, and that they should focus on more peaceful ones. Some people in Quebec Parliament accuse it of being, quote, federalist propaganda.
Which I find, again, really intriguing, because there are so many Quebecois Heritage Minutes. I think disproportionately there are a lot of Quebecois Heritage Minutes, like,
especially from that.
Yeah, even like
period.
Really early. Like, I think his name is Louis Papineau, but it's like, Jewish people can be full citizens. It's just like, okay. that's a great, obviously, like, legal accomplishment.
Yeah.
Is that inherently Canadian? I'm not sure.
I think that ties into that point, though, is that it is federalist in the sense that it's like, sweet, we're going to really kind of, like, give you the attention you so badly want. Please stay with us. Please don't go.
Yeah.
True, that's true.
And I think that's more what it is, because you're absolutely right. There was a bunch of Quebecois once, like you said, like the Papineau one.
Frontenac. It's like...
Well, Frontenac. Well, for sure.
Frontenac.
For sure. The Cartier one, the Etienne Cartier one, I think is great, because that's like great, like that's a nation building one, and
that is
falls
a really
in
interesting
one.
one.
The three categories that I think exist.
I like that there was an Etienne Cartier one before there was a Sir John A. Macdonald one, even though they're really a couple.
Oh yeah, for sure.
In that kind of event. But for sure.
Absolutely.
And the one that I really wanted to touch on, because it's one that I really remember from my childhood, and I thought I was suffering from the Mandela effect, because when we sat down and watched them, this episode was not in there, and I'm like, did I make up this episode? Because there is one that for a long time was pulled out of rotation, which is the Canadian Peacekeeper one. Now, the Canadian Peacekeeper one is interesting because
it's in the Congo,
there are some...
right?
Pardon me?
No, this
Oh,
is
this
another
is a
one.
different
Is
one.
this the
Yeah.
one?
This is a
the one where
different
the guy
one.
jumps over with
No.
his hat? No.
Let me explain this to you.
John Osborne.
let's-
Yeah, that's
One
yeah.
thing that we've
He
hardly
did
touched
Neptune.
upon with these minutes is how quotable some of them are.
Yeah.
I smelt burnt toast.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is a shorthand joke that almost every Canadian knows. It is the "I've fallen and I can't get up" for Canada of that generation.
And I
is so
didn't
true.
know. I didn't know that was such a Canadian thing until I like made American friends who were like, "What do you mean?"
But it really is. But the other one that I remember on the playground, people would get into a play fight or something. Somebody would stop and would go, "No, go home, go home." And
I didn't get this until I saw it.
no, because I'm a little bit older, so I actually remember this being on TV for a couple of years.
this one.
It is about Canadian peacekeepers in Turkey,
Cyprus.
in Cyprus.
Yeah.
A fight breaks out between,
A Turk and a Cypriot.
and they're fighting, and with the blue helmet, the peacekeeper goes up, they're like, no, you guys have to stop.
Oh no, I do know this.
And they're like, oh, we'll stay out of this. And then he just keeps saying, no, go home. Go home.
Oh,
and it was
wow.
it was a common joke.
It's like the
That you'd just be
deep
like, or the
recesses of
Canadian
my
military would
brain.
come up. It's like, oh yeah, the Canadian military. What we do is that we go up to people and tell them to go home.
Yeah.
Like it
Yeah.
was shorthand and a big reference point. And I had no idea that it got pulled from circulation. They maintain that it's because of inaccurate costume details.
I highly doubt that.
Yeah.
But also the Turkish
it's
ambassador,
insane.
apparently the Turkish ambassador also complained about the short.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm sure
But they
he did.
maintain that had nothing to do with it. But I wanted to bring that up because, like I said,
Interesting.
that was up there with "I Smell Burnt Toast" of quotability back in the day.
Wow.
Because no, it's
And
like,
you can
it
now get it
totally,
online, but
Totally
yeah.
falls in line with like all of those RCMP ones in which
Yeah.
like you present Canadian military as peacekeepers, not as a military force. Like in all of the RCMP ones, there's always an American to juxtapose what the RCMP is doing.
Or
in this
in
one,
that case-
you have just foreigners
Just
to
foreigners.
juxtapose what a peacekeeper is doing. In general, I think they've stopped showing a lot of the peacekeeper ones. Like I think of the
Yeah.
Osborne one, for example.
Well, but Osborne also wasn't the peacekeeper. That was Hong Kong,
true,
right?
true.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
What I want to do, we're going to talk. I just want to bring up really quickly the tradition of the format, and then the sort of cultural impact that these shorts have had. And this came up when you were talking earlier about. You only have 90 of these things to go through, and you've been going through the
Yeah.
episodes really quickly. And I've listened to a few podcasts that do things based on lists or something very finite. This does actually have a tradition within our country that goes back to through the NFB with the Hinterlands Who's Who. Like Little Nature Minutes.
Don't
That
get me
go on.
don't get me started.
But-
But, like concerned children's advertising, like the TV.
But it's a very similar concept.
Get this cat off my head.
And again, for anyone not Canadian, they're kind of like heritage minutes, but they focus on different animals and
yeah.
stuff like that.
Yeah.
And then there are the Canada vignettes that were in the late 70s. They vary in length, but they were very similar, put out by the NFB. And if you are familiar with them as a concept, because I didn't know that these were part of a series. There are various different, some of them animated, different little shorts exploring different parts of Canadian culture and history. This is where we get the Log Driver's Waltz.
Yeah.
100%, yeah.
And there are some very interesting ones. They're NFB, so they're a little bit more experimental, but they're kind of the precursor to the Heritage Minute.
Okay, yeah.
They tend to be, like I said, more experimental. They weren't commercials, even though they showed. I think I would see most of them on TV Ontario.
Yeah,
or something.
I saw them on MTN, Manitoba Television Network.
Yeah.
Even Buckley, Kids Club, yeah.
So, anyways, those are really neat to check out.
Yeah.
So now I want to talk about the legacy of the Heritage Minutes.
Yes.
Particularly in comedy. I really remember a lot from when I was younger. The Comedy Network had what they called sacrilege moments. Have you seen any of these?
Yes,
Yeah.
I've seen a handful.
Yeah. Some of them aged better than
Others.
others.
Naturally.
I'll just say it. Gay jokes haven't aged very well.
Yeah.
Although, damn it, the whole one about the CN Tower just looking like a giant penis.
yeah.
That's not
Still,
gay.
no, that still works.
That's a
that
I was
works.
raised as a Torontonian.
Penis
So
jokes,
some of those,
timeless.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Jokes never go down.
some of those are really worth checking out if you're curious. All sorts of shows. I tried watching some of them. Like this hour has 22 minutes.
They have a lot of parody here.
And
But also it's a meme now.
Yeah,
Like,
it's a big
so when
meme
Toronto won the NBA championship last year, they had Kawhi in Heritage Minute frame.
Yeah, finding one, that's why I'm looking at it.
Yeah, so they don't go the whole way, but like...
They also did it when Stephen McNeil said Stay the Blazes Home.
Stay the Blazes Home, Heritage Minute.
I wanted to touch one of my favorite cartoonists out there, Kate Beaton.
Yeah.
Has a couple of really
Kate
good
Bretner?
ones. The one about where they send out the basketball one, and it's about getting the shoes and to see what not bling, the origins of.
Oh, it's just like the whole. Oh, okay. While you figure this one out. Oh, shit.
Well, okay. For the Kate Beaton ones, there's one about Margaret Trudeau.
Yeah.
Which is really, really funny. And I'm disappointed that they aren't actually in my Kate Beaton collections there.
Oh.
Sorry,
the origin of Nice Kicks.
Oh, yes.
Is her thing, but you must love Kate Beaton being a history person because her stuff is
Kate
brilliant.
Bretner, she's from Marguerite.
She's from Marguerite?
Yeah, she's from Mabu, sorry.
Okay, Mabu, Marguerite, whatever. Somewhere on that side of the island.
That's
the
anybody
island,
from Marguerite? I went to Marguerite when I was in grade 9 for soccer provincials. I fell in love with a boy. His name was Patrick Murphy. No word of a fucking lie.
I already know that story.
Yeah.
Fell in love with a boy. His name was Patrick Murphy. But I will say, in terms of legacy of Heritage Minutes, I think it says a lot about them that you can reference them without talking about the content of the Heritage Minute. It's literally a form and like this formula that you can fill in the blanks to, and you're like, oh yeah, people will get it. And it'll be funny.
Now, my favorite one, and I don't know if you've seen this, the online comedy troupe Loading Ready Run.
No, I haven't.
Is there a way that we can actually just watch? No, you have to see this because it's a Heritage Minute about the history of the Heritage Minutes.
Oh, brilliant.
It is.
Check it out when you get a chance.
We will. We definitely will.
Okay, Hunter sent this to me last night, and I'm kind of just like a jaded, kind of shitty dude, and I was sitting in my room watching it, and I was just cackling. Like, I'm not sure if you heard me actually, like, cackling through the walls at some of it.
It's pretty accurate to how the Heritage Minutes came about.
I love that.
But I made the crack earlier, but my favorite line from it is when they get the go-ahead to do it, and the guy just kind of puffs up, he's like, we'll need a lot of big beards.
Yeah.
That's so funny.
Okay, and now a brief roundtable thing that we just kind of touched on before. We are going to tackle what we are surprised is not a Heritage Minute.
Okay.
One of the first ones I went to was the Winnipeg General Strike.
Right.
I think is a very important one in the history of our country. Or the fact that we do have the Sam Steele one, but nothing focusing on the gold rush.
Yeah.
Right.
Which is huge.
Yeah.
So that's just my two examples right now of ones that I'm surprised are not Heritage Minutes.
Roberta Bondard, Frederick Banting, Tommy Douglas, Alexander Graham Bell. Like, they have controversy around them sometimes, but I think generally people associate their accomplishments with Canada, or they have been recognized in another way. Like, there's the Alexander Graham Bell Museum. It's a federal park. Like, I'm surprised that they don't have one about him.
I mean, they do have an episode on Sir John A. Macdonald.
Yes.
Right? And he's a
technically
controversial
technically it's about Confederation.
Yeah.
But
and it's
true.
new.
And it is newer. It's 2014.
It's
like, you would think that would be such an early one, but it's not.
Yeah.
Sorry, what was the first one you said, Grace?
Roberta Bondard. She's the first Canadian woman in space.
She's you totally recognize her. She's in the orange spacesuit, short hair, nice smile.
For sure.
Yeah, she's she's pretty classic in that.
And maybe that's just me because she did like a speaking tour to like elementary school.
Yeah, I heard her speak when I was a kid
so
too.
To me, I'm like, oh yeah, she's like a quintessential Canadian.
Yeah.
I'm surprised she doesn't have a Heritage Minute.
Well, also
there is one about female aviation, I guess.
Yeah, there is.
Yeah, but that's not like I get that, right? Because it's like you also want to kind of like I wouldn't know who as Mona Parsons love her. But I wouldn't know her if it wasn't for the Heritage Minutes.
100%. And I think that's what Heritage Minutes are brilliant at, is that they can pull a name like Mona Parsons, who really is not crucial to Canadian World War II war efforts. Like, you can easily tell the story of even like the liberation of Holland without talking about her.
Yeah.
But her story is so incredible. It's like, it's a shame if it wouldn't get recognized in some way.
For me, I have a couple episodes that I think should be Heritage Minutes. I mean,
you should be surprised that they're not.
I have.
Because I might pick some like my dream ones if I could have them.
That's tricky.
But
I think mine are more like ones that I think should be, and I'm a little surprised that these people haven't been recognized. And I just have to pull up a few. Can I? Okay. So for me, the first person that I'm surprised by, that I'm really it just seems like a natural fit for a Heritage Minute is George Orton. And a lot of people don't know about George Orton. He's my Heritage Minute cutie. I think he should be. During the start of the quarantine, Grace and I were doing some Facebook Lives where we switched roles, and I would find a Canadian history kind of thing that wasn't a Heritage Minute, and we would talk about it, and I would kind of educate Grace a little. So George Orton was one of the first ones I did. So George Orton competed in the Olympics in 1900 for the first time, and he won the first ever gold medal for Canada.
Okay.
And he's a white male athlete. Like, it just seems like a very natural fit. So I am surprised that it wasn't one of the original ones that kind of came out.
Also, he's someone who would today qualify for the Paralympics.
Yeah,
and he won
in the regular Olympics. So what is interesting about him is that when he was about like 3-4 years old, he was out playing with his brothers, as we do, climbing trees and stuff, and he fell. And he fell on I think it was the right side of his body, and he really badly injured his right arm, and it like stunted the developmental growth and nerve damage.
Oh, shit.
So he competed in these races and was an athlete for Canada without having any mobility in his right arm. And it wasn't a time, like, I don't know, like now I don't know if it was something that would be like amputated or whatever, but in the late 1800s, like it wasn't. He just like lived with a limp arm. It was much smaller. You can see in pictures. Most pictures he's posed with his left facing forward to try to hide it, but you can see it in some of his competition photos. What's also interesting about him is that he competed at that time, Canada didn't have a flag. And when you were competing in the Olympics, you usually competed for your university. And he was going to an American university. It wasn't until he was almost 80 years old that George Orton was recognized as being a Canadian athlete and having the first gold medal for Canada. Okay. Like, that just seems like a story that Historic Canada would just eat up.
Yeah.
And then he also went on to be like a professor of philosophy.
He was a professor of philosophy.
He wrote poetry. He basically brought hockey to Philadelphia.
Yeah. He brought hockey to Philadelphia. He created
Philadelphia Hockey
Club. Yeah.
I don't know if that's
and
what goes
soccer.
So indirectly, he's responsible for that mascot?
Yes, that's what we said. That's what we said.
So really,
Gritty.
Yeah.
He's responsible for Gritty.
Yeah.
He created he brought soccer to Philadelphia. Like, he started the first soccer clubs that were in Philadelphia. He worked for years as like an advocate. He wrote several books, some on sport training and other books of poetry.
Yeah.
He's this super cool dude who was just like modest and great and just
also an Olympian.
It
just so happens.
And that was pretty much like his life. He just like, it's just like, I'm an Olympian.
So,
and I really think that he should be in a Heritage Minute.
No, see, that brings up an interesting point, which is something that I found watching these. I brought this up before, but I never actually got around to the point. There's like different categories of these Heritage Minutes.
Yeah.
There's like the war ones, I think, are very uniquely themselves.
Yeah.
I think there's like the Confederation ones, which are very uniquely themselves.
Yeah.
The kind of colonial era ones.
Yeah.
And there's like the feel good sports ones, just so you're just like, oh, thank fuck. Like some of the
and
women's.
And sidebar.
The women's history one is that's
like it's its own column.
It is definitely its own column, 100%.
Grace and I kind of love sports.
Yeah,
and so any excuse we have to be able, I think it's possible that all of the things I talked to you about in those little episodes were about sports. Like, we talked about
Chris Hatfield.
Oh yeah, we talked about Chris Hatfield. But again, maybe when he's dead.
I mean, please don't leave us yet.
Yeah, right.
Please just don't leave us yet.
But another one that I really think should be a Heritage Minute is Willie O'Reilly. And if you don't know Willie O'Reilly, he is basically the Jackie Robinson of hockey. He was the first African Canadian. He was the first black hockey player in the NHL. And he played for the Boston Bruins. And he really was. He was a huge role model for so many like black young men and athletes, just like seeing that he could be in the NHL, he could be successful. He became and was just so respected by the hockey community. Like, he was a real asset. It wasn't like a favor. It was, you know, like he's actually like damn good enough to be here. And I think that he would be a good Heritage Minute.
So this is going into the next question then.
Yeah.
Now Spencer doggedly yesterday refused to let me actually say what my pick was ahead of time. You wanted it to be on the show. So yeah, and I mean my passion is obviously the arts. There's not a lot of artist representation on here.
Sorry, just to clarify, we're going into...
No, I'm just bringing up ones that I'm surprised aren't there.
Okay.
Or, you know, that I think... Well, one of them... Anyways, like, especially musicians aren't covered. Especially since he's passed, like one on Leonard Cohen.
Yeah.
I think would be really good.
Yeah, for sure.
Even though it was really recent, it would be very easy. And I think, even though I'm not a fan myself, the final Tragically Hip concert.
Yeah, 100%.
Not to say I dislike the Tragically Hit, just outside of one album just hasn't really done much for me. But even I watched that thing and got teary.
Oh, yeah.
Like, it was a huge cultural
Everyone watched
impact.
it, yes.
And so I definitely think that is one that they should do in the future.
And they were a band that very much defined themselves as we're a Canadian rock band.
Yeah,
Like,
we
all
are,
of their geographic references are Canadian geographic
And
references.
everybody thinks about it, they can picture Gord Downey with the hat and the Jaws t-shirt on stage.
Well, it's so true. I mean,
Yeah.
people, you ask a Canadian, like, you know that Bob Cajun's a real place.
Yeah.
Because it's an
I
attractive
had a friend whose parents were there, and
Yeah.
we go there for weekends quite often.
We actually, funnily enough, saw them at the same time.
But not
in
together.
2011, like we were together.
Well, we were even talking the other day. I saw the hit about 4 or 5 times.
Yeah.
But I was always going for opening bands.
I saw
Yeah.
them
You know, like I saw
times.
I saw there another roadside attraction twice.
I saw
But I'm going
them-
for Matthew Sweet and
I
Eric's
saw them
Trip.
to see
You know?
I saw them twice, and one time I was so excited because the Arkells were opening for them,
Yeah.
and it was before the Arkells were big, and I felt so cool because I like knew like 2 songs about the Arkells. I was like in high school, and I was like, oh, this is like a super cool band.
My parents would be remiss if I didn't bring up that. So they would see, the Tragically Hip would be an opener when they were in university. So they were the opening band, and they would come to St. FX, where my parents went to university. But and this, like in their generation and their friend group, they weren't the hip; they were the trad.
Oh.
Yeah. So to this day, like I grew up, and my dad is a huge Tragically Hip fan.
Yeah.
And so he's just like they're the trad.
Yeah.
They've always been the trad in my house.
So in other words, Heritage Moments, get on this episode.
Yeah,
We're all in
yeah,
agreement.
absolutely.
Anybody else
They used to be
have
all-
any episodes or surprises that aren't?
Like the arts that they represent in Heritage Minutes, they tend to be visual arts. So like Emily Carr, they have Kenna Schweigashevek, for example.
Which
but they
it blows
don't-
my mind that she has a Heritage Minute.
She's pretty famous, I think,
She
within
is,
graphic
yes.
arts
Yeah,
fields.
for sure.
But
I know,
there
but I
aren't
guess-
very many
yeah.
musical artists. And I
When
think
you
the
think
only
about our
ones-
musical
you have
tradition, yeah.
Stratford Theater,
Yeah.
and you have, which isn't technically
Yeah.
music, I guess, but and then you have the
National
time
Anthem.
you have the national anthem, and then you have
Yeah.
Cassava organs.
Yes.
Yeah, the organ episode.
But I mean,
about
when
it, I
you
think,
start
right?
running down Neil Young, Joni Mitchell.
Neil Young. Okay,
you know,
I'm sorry.
yeah.
Like
If you talk
where-
about
is
Canadian
this-
exports, it's music
Oh,
and
he's
comedy,
not on here.
like
Yeah.
in terms of arts,
Yeah,
right?
for
So
the
I
most
find
part.
it really interesting that they don't get featured.
Hell yeah.
Oh, and the
Neil
one that
Young.
I would push for that I completely forgot about is being a film nerd, Mary Pickford.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah,
her with Douglas Fairbanks, they
Yeah.
were the original Hollywood power couple. She was super powerful
You're right.
in the 20s silent age. I have a book over there that's all about Canadians in the golden age of Hollywood.
So I remembered another musical one, La Balzac,
Oh yeah.
which is very French Canadian, but she's like a French like radio star.
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
That's right.
But
Yes, yes, yes.
Very strange.
I even brought that up. That
Obscure.
these would be an amazing tool to find out about Quebec culture.
Right.
You know, that most of us are greatly ignorant of. Like, and I find
Definitely
this as
music-wise, outside
scratching
of,
the
like,
surface of
Celine Dion.
film. And I've seen a lot of Quebecois film, but yeah, in terms of
Like,
music,
like,
that's one of my criticisms, that I think in terms of the arts, it's a little bit of a missed opportunity of sharing some cultural
Yeah.
aspects of our country that don't get a lot of
100%.
attention.
Yeah,
Sure.
for sure. yeah.
On the note of these ones that you're surprised aren't made, Komagata Maru. We talk so much about like East Asian discrimination. We have the Asahi one.
Yeah.
We have the rail workers ones. But the Komagata Maru that's a huge point of like South Asian discrimination in Canadian history that we just don't talk about. That's still present. I've heard people straight up say,
For those of us that may be ignorant on the matter, could you...
but the thing is that okay, the Komagata Maru was the turning away of British subjects from India, because this happened when India was still a colony. We were a dominion, and the idea was that Canadian citizenship could be given out to anyone who was a British subject.
Yeah. In the
Except
Commonwealth.
Indians.
Yeah,
So you
exactly.
had to be in the Commonwealth, and then you're allowed.
So you're a British subject in India, Hong Kong, anyone where like they fly the Union Jack, you can go to another one of those countries and be accepted as a citizen, right? Because the idea though was that because of the Komagata Maru, them being Canadian immigration officials, Canadians, white Canadians in general, didn't want to have Indians come over from India, despite being British subjects, despite having like on paper an allegiance to the crown, in Canada simply because they're not white.
Right.
So that's a really good point that you brought up.
And it's interesting because it's one of the most dominant minority groups in Canada now. I think Punjabi is the second most commonly spoken language in Canada. It's more than French.
Yeah. So, which is,
They have hockey night in Canada and Punjab.
In Punjab, exactly.
Grace and I actually will do our little shout out because we have BBFFs. Both of our best friends are our best brown friends forever. We have
they're both Indian.
Yeah, they're both Indian. Both their parents grew up in India and came over to Canada. They're first gen.
Awesome.
Weird similarity that we have. But I learned a lot about that from my friend Kaya, from her mom Nilangana, when she was doing her citizenship test here, because she talked about how for so long, people from India didn't want to come to Canada because you were just so discriminated against.
Yeah, 100%.
And she said, it's just that's a real part of your heritage that like people don't talk about. Because like we were different and we ate different food and we had different values. And she said it was like that classic form of like, you judge what you don't understand.
For sure. There were two more that I was just surprised about.
Yeah.
Norman Bethune, Dr. Bethune.
He's a very controversial guy, though.
Well, okay, what? Because he was like left-leaning? We're going to have someone who actually like actively set out to have like genocide on indigenous populations, but not someone who developed battlefield medicine and just because they happened to help out in 2 wars that didn't concern them, the forwarding of like medicine.
And they could go the total Grey Owl Avro Arrow route and just have the Donald Sutherland movie and just pull clips from that.
But see, the issue is that I don't think that you could do that anymore. I think
I'm
do
being
that
facetious.
Oh, I know. But I think that's like for people who haven't watched all the episodes, maybe like those are a little bit like they're cringy. They're vintage.
They're very cringy.
They're cringy, and it's watching.
If he's an indigenous person, then I'm the king of China.
Well, it wasn't wrong.
I'm the king of China. I love that. Such a classic.
Oh yes. And the last one I had was the the Mackenzie Papineau Regiment. Spanish Civil War.
Yeah. That is.
Again, I think that's a political thing because it's like
one of the few things I know from like grade 9 social studies.
Really?
Like Mackenzie Papineau.
We never touched that.
Yeah.
It was like Mackenzie Papineau. Like they go to Spain. They're fighting like Franco and the nationalists because they're fighting for the Republicans, and it's like premature fascism. The idea was that like you couldn't, to this day, even guys who went to like Syria that to fight ISIS with the Kurds and that, you couldn't swear allegiance to another country. So this like you could go, but you couldn't let anyone know you were going.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right, and so the idea was that they're like, no, fascism's bad. I think this would be a great counter to the Marconi episode where it would be like, short.
Revisions,
minute, right, would be to be like, no, we had a bunch of guys who were too young for the First World War and would later some of them would take some of this into the Second World War, but for generally, you're just people being like, no, this is bullshit, we're going to go beat up on fascists.
Yeah.
And a part of our heritage. There you go. It sounds so good,
absolutely.
right?
Yeah, and it does make me like the Marconi one, for example. Like I do think there are ones that wouldn't be made today, but I also think there are ones that would still be made, but made differently. Like Sitting Bull. Like I think that one would still be made, but I think it would be talked about far less from this like, look how the RCMP is like this neutral negotiator between 2 nations and their diplomacy. It's like, well, you also were extremely resistant to having any of those Lakota stay in Canada, and you did not assist
Well,
them
that
in
one's
any
weird
way,
because it has
right?
that funny note. It's like a little stinger at the end.
Very, very end, yeah.
Yes.
You know, where it's like, and then they were forced out anyways. Okay.
Anyways.
Yeah. Moving along, right?
Anyways.
Oh my god.
All right, back to American Idol.
Yeah.
Anybody else have any examples?
So, okay, there's definitely two that I want to see. Though I will say, now I think I'm biased because I want ones that are made with like tricky backstories because I want to be able to talk about
Yeah.
those on our
That's fair.
podcast. I'm very biased in what I want. But one, I think Joseph Howe, they're also both Nova Scotian, again,
Yeah.
biased, but Joseph Howe, I think, would be an
Yeah.
excellent Heritage Minute. Not actually about his anti-Confederation work, but I think his court cases over libel and freedom of the press. Like, I think
Yeah.
that is something that Canadians generally would view as a value. Like, we have an intense belief in our freedom of speech and our freedom of the press, and he went and had a very like vicious, hilarious, publicized court battle over
Yeah.
it. Like, I think there's so much authentic content there to make a really good Heritage Minute about. And then obviously he goes on and is this huge anti-Confederate and like is just this little shit disturber for the rest of his political career. But I think that moment it would fit a lot of the criteria of a Heritage Minute.
Yeah.
And then the other one that for political reasons I think will never be made, but I think is super interesting, is J.B. Mclaughlin. So J.B. Mclaughlin was a Scottish immigrant, and he was essentially the union leader for miners in Cape Breton. Also, like, met Lenin. Like, he's that red. Like, huge communist, leader of the Communist Party in Canada for a period of time. Hence, I don't think he would ever have a Heritage Minute made about him.
Yeah.
But he's so interesting, and he starts a lot of the conversations about workers' rights that I think in the Canadian sphere is usually talked about within the West. So you have like Winnipeg General Strike, you have grain worker like unions in Saskatchewan. Like, I think that's typically where we start the conversation, like Tommy Douglas, and like that's
Yeah.
where socialism
Yeah.
starts. But if you look at pockets of mine workers in Eastern Canada, they're very much contemporaries, and they have similar conversations happening in equally violent ways as well. Like in Cape Breton, we have Davis Day because you have a union or a mine police killing protesters.
Strike breaker.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, Joseph Howe, J.B. Mclaughlin, I think those two would be really interesting Heritage Minutes, though I don't know if they'll ever be made.
So are we moving into Dream Heritage Minutes now? Is that, are those
Are we?
yours?
Those are my two.
You
Those
can,
are your dream
you can
ones.
cut this if I'm wrong, but there isn't a Heritage Minute actually about the city mines disaster. The Spring Hill
there
mine
is
disaster.
one.
There is one.
There is one,
Okay.
and it's a black miner. It's like, it hits a lot of layers. Because he's also like a member of like a certain church that
Yes.
I don't know the full story behind it,
Yeah.
but Spring Hill.
But there
is
is one
yeah.
about the Spring Hill mine
Nova Scotia
disaster.
loves disasters.
Oh, sure we
So-
fucking do. Bring on another one.
Please.
So again, because I don't want to have the last word, I'll really quickly run through mine. I brought up before the sort of tenuous nature of the Joe Shuster Superman Heritage Minute, especially when there is a rich history of comics in Canada.
Yeah.
Particularly a little known part of Canadian history or Canadian comics history in general is that during World War II, because of tariffs, American comic books stopped shipping to Canada.
Oh, okay.
So we stopped getting Superman and Batman comics, and this made this little spike, and it's kind of a little on the shelf there, a little section that I have of like, you know, trying to get collections of these like weird era of comics. So in-house, we actually started to make Canadian superheroes.
Okay.
You know, with Canadian talent. And the one that I would want to do a Canadian Heritage Minute on is Nelvana of the Northern Lights.
Oh. I was gonna
Predates,
say, are they like Beaver Boy
Is it a
and
girl?
Flapjack
It is.
Man?
It's a woman?
predates Wonder Woman by 4 months.
Okay.
Hitting the stands.
That's
And
sick.
she's
And she rides a
indigenous.
great
She's indigenous.
She looks like
She's an
Lady,
Inuit.
She looks like Lady
she
Godiva,
rides
but
Great
is
Danes?
that a dog?
Yeah. It's a bonkers comic.
Well,
it's
you know-
bonkers,
no,
and
I
obviously
love
you can
that.
tell it's very crude by standards, by the printing standards that they had at the time.
Yeah, sure.
I spent years keeping an eye out. Cal at Strange Adventures found this.
Oh, okay.
Because it was actually kickstarted the collection.
Oh shit.
That somebody went out to collect the issues and stuff like that.
That's
Because
so cool.
it's a part of Canadian history no one knows about.
Yeah.
Like, at all. And I also have like a Johnny Canuck collection up there. That was another one of that era's heroes. And I think it would fit perfectly into that sort of heritage moment of nobody has any idea about this, but this is a really cool that, 3 months before Wonder Woman, we had our own indigenous female superhero.
Yeah.
Aspects of it don't age well. We're talking about Golden Age comics. That's across the board.
Yeah.
But this is the one that I decided to pick. If I could have one heritage moment made just to educate the world about Canadian comics, it would be Nelvana of the Northern Lights, created by Adrian Dingle.
Very
Interesting.
cool.
I love that. Do you have any dream ones, Lynnea?
You kind of did yours.
You did George Orton.
Is there another one?
I don't know. George Orton. I said Willie O'Reilly. I think that's it. Like, I think that they should be, but I'd be like super happy like if they were. I think that they'd be really good ones. I think that they'd be good fits.
Yeah.
Mine are kind of like the same. Like the ones that I am surprised aren't.
Yeah.
Are also the ones. But I mean, and like I said, Colonel Chris Hadfield. I mean, maybe when he dies.
Yeah.
Which hopefully
Probably
isn't
won't happen
soon.
while he's alive. It would be weird to have a heritage minute put out about you while you're still living. You're like, I've still got, time.
Yeah.
Okay, I might go do some
Watch
other
me
stuff.
fuck this up. All right.
Hold my beer.
It's kind of like,
hold my
but
beer, exactly.
I think it is, we talk about a lot in the podcast how like, when you've made it in Canada, it's like being on a postage stamp. But I think it's also like, being in a heritage minute. Like that's like posthumously
That's like an elite club.
being in a heritage minute. It is.
That
It's
is.
a
That's
very,
like the order of merit level.
It's a very elite group.
Well, there's less than 90.
Yeah.
So it's like, of all of the Canadians, and some of them aren't even about people. So if you want to have a whole heritage minute dedicated to you, you really gotta
prorated
make
to
a name
90
for
seconds.
yourself.
Yeah, for sure.
Prorated to 90 seconds. Yeah.
So Spencer, you were really secretive about yours, so I'm really curious
Okay.
as to what your dream heritage
I
minute
pared
is.
I pared mine down. Okay.
Okay.
I had a bunch because I'm like, fuck. There's just so much that we don't know about in our own history that just makes wicked stories. Almighty Voice is Plains Cree. I might be wrong. Man who decides like, fuck no, I'm not responsible to any white man's government, and just goes on a tear through Saskatchewan. And he's like the last, like the Americans kind of have Geronimo as like this last like indigenous rebellion in like that's pre-colonial,
Okay.
right?
What year would this be?
This
Like-
is I want to say it's early 20th century. Like we're talking like it's late, like it's post Louis Riel by about 30 years.
Okay.
Right? So we're looking at about 1905. I should have actually researched this more now because I just remember I remember reading about Almighty Voice, and it's just like the RCMP start like coming after him, and he just like leads them on a chase. He's just going through a tear, and I think that's so awesome. I'm like 100%.
Yeah.
And kind of in the same vein, Cuthbert Grant or Gabrielle Dumont would be wicked because it's just like you have like post Wolseley's expedition, you have like a bunch of just like British troops and like Northwest Mounted Police and like Northwest Rifles and all these military units during the insurrection, like in Saskatchewan and that, like the later one, the 1885 one, and they just get spanked by a bunch of like these guys just riding around on horses who are like, you come into my house and tell me how to fight my war. You look at things like Batoche and like Duck Lake and stuff where they're just like, they embarrass the Northwest Mounted Police, they embarrass the British Army, they embarrass like all the Canadian recruits. That's just awesome. And then like someone like Cuthbert Grant, like Diefenbaker met him as a boy because he was still just riding around, just like warden of the plains. They respected these fighters enough that they're like, well, I'll tell you what, how would you come work for us, right? It's kind of that like, there's this weird kind of thing in history, I find, especially English history, where like you kind of really respect your like historical rivals to a point. It's like, why?
Well, if you're beating them, they should be as good as possible because then that says more about you and your victory.
It's why every English, like every Anglophone on the face of the earth knows who Napoleon is, despite the fact Napoleon's French.
Yeah,
because he's such a good adversary, like, I'm making air quotes and I'm not going to cut it out this time, but it's like the same deal as here, right? You have like these legends of the High Plains who aren't strictly Indigenous and aren't strictly European. And
Right.
I think that's kind of criminal to be cut that out.
Which I think, because it kind of flies in one's hand, it really supports what Canadians think Canadians are, in the sense that we're interracial, we're like, we don't fall in line with like one culture, like we blended cultures and that's how we created our own.
Yeah.
But it also flies in the face of what Canadians say that their nation was created upon, which is diplomacy, and like we didn't need a revolution because we had confederation and we built everything out of peace and democracy. But the whole history of Canadian Western expansion is war after war after war. It's just not with the Canadian military, it's with a militant police force.
Yeah.
Fuck yeah. Holy shit.
You're so smart.
I have, there was my ultimate one. Those were kind of like leading up to my personal favorite moment in Canadian
Let's
history.
hear it.
It's going to sound so hackneyed after that. So, HMCS Oakville was a flower class
Whoa.
Corvette.
She was a beautiful boat.
Okay, no, I'm not saying anything.
Corvettes are beautiful.
Corvettes are beautiful.
The Sackville on the waterfront with the blue dazzle paint, she pretty. She's a Corvette.
razzle dazzle one.
I love Dazzle Camo.
It's not camo.
And now the well,
There was Dazzle Camo.
There was.
So, no heritage minutes about the Navy. There's
Yeah,
a bunch on the Army.
About the Navy.
There's a bunch on the Air Force. I'm a little biased, but like, holy shit, that is the funniest shit to me. And it's like, it's just a black comedy. The article I read was just like, it's a black comedy because like, here's this like concussed 20-something-year-old sticking a gun in some German's face, and he's like, he didn't even realize that they probably didn't understand what he was saying.
Yeah.
When he's like, okay, come on up. He's like, oh, the understood come. Because that's the same in German and English, so
Right.
they're just like, fuck yeah, no, but like, we're good.
Why are
we
you
got
naked?
it. Well, it
You know?
kind of reminds me of not what they show in the Heritage Minute, but the Andrew Minarsky one. It's
Oh,
like
yeah.
such a black comedy. If you like the first guy trying to escape the
frickin'
aircraft,
Friday knocks himself out.
and it's just like great,
Great.
love that for us.
Love that. Yeah, that's funny, and that actually, you know, talking about like Navy and like wartime stuff, it reminded me of another one that I would love to see in the Heritage Minute, which is Boat Camp Norway, which is in Lunenburg, which I just think would be so great. That's such a huge part of like Lunenburg's heritage. It's such a.
What is it exactly?
So Camp Norway was a Norwegian. It wasn't really a base.
Yeah, because Norway was invaded pretty early on in the Second World War, but a bunch of their sailors made it to Canada because they had a big merchant navy. And they're like, no, we're going to keep fighting.
Yeah, we're going to keep going. And so they get to Lunenburg, and so the families just kind of. Basically, they just fell in love with a bunch of women from Lunenburg, and they like then had roots there, and then and so there's a really large Norwegian population, and for a while, like during that time, the Norwegian population, it was like quite big, like because it's a small town, and so they kind of like overtook, and it became this like very much like the Norwegian culture was like really brought out, and it's still like the sign's still there. And
if Historica Canada listens to this episode, they have a good chunk of the next 10 episodes that they can have right there.
Absolutely.
Of great ideas.
Yeah, like they should be paying us.
Yes. Don't know why they're not. Hey, Historica Canada.
I pay my taxes.
Yeah.
I want some of that back.
Yeah.
So,
I've got a federal student loan. I deserve some compensation.
I'll throw this out to you guys. The last question of any episode is, what does the Heritage Minute say about Canada?
Oh, wow. What doesn't it say about Canada?
It kind of says everything.
What doesn't it say?
Okay, I think, so one thing that really resonates with me that says about the Heritage Minutes, so they're so buckshot. Like, they try to hit on everything, and in some way, they kind of lose, I think, some kind of continuation throughout them. Yeah. Consistency.
Continuity. That's the word. God, we worked so hard for that. Jesus.
I think Canadians constantly have this identity crisis of like, when we go abroad, people have ideas of what a Canadian is, and then once you come to Canada, I think the identity is so broken down into region. Like, it's such a massive country. Like, how can you possibly unify people under one banner or one sentiment? But I think there are so few things that do truly resonate from coast to coast to coast, and I think Heritage Minutes are one of them. And so, in this kind of funny roundabout way, I think the content, they tried to create some sense of national identity, but it wound up being the medium that was the identity in itself.
Thank you,
And
Marcia
the medium
McLuhan.
is the message,
Yeah.
if
The
you
medium
will.
is the message.
I
If
didn't even
you
touch
will.
upon that one. Oh, geez. That always happens with this show. Something gets brought up at the very end, and we're like, oh, we didn't even talk about that one.
Damn
That's
it.
okay.
Okay, well, guys, thank you so much for
Oh,
coming
thank
on.
you.
This
Thank
will
you.
be like a marble statue. We now have
Oh my God.
the giant block of marble,
Yeah.
which is the recording of this episode, and we will gradually whittle it down until
knows
we,
what
until we
this
have
Yeah.
a beautiful stat figure that is just in there. It just has to be chiseled out.
Apologies
Not a work for
to you,
Spencer.
Spencer.
Sorry.
Not a word for Spencer. I
This is the
think
most ambitious crossover in podcast history.
I think it's also how we're
Every
recording
segment
it.
is like, we're
'cause-
sorry
Yeah.
to Spencer for
We
all
just
the
wanna
editing he had to do.
apologize.
I mean, this will probably be cut out, but it's also like, I think the way that we're recording the episode is literally a mic in the middle of the room, and we're hanging out on chairs and couches, so it feels like we're just hanging out,
Yeah. so-
having a conversation, so you
Yeah.
kind of lose sight of the track.
Yeah,
That
that's that. I would prefer that to us being very sterile and
No, for sure.
Yeah.
no,
What?
there's lots of
Okay.
great stuff in here. Don't get me wrong.
For
I
sure.
wouldn't have this happen
Yeah.
any other way.
Yeah, so I'm Lynnea Swinmer,
And I'm Grace Vignette.
and we just want to thank you so much for tuning into this episode of North and Normal Podcast. It was so great to be here.
Super fun.
These guys are amazing. They're awesome. Listen to their podcast, and also listen to our podcast.
Please, God.
Please. We can't wait to have these guys on our show eventually.
Yeah, so we're Minute Women Podcast. You can find us on all major podcast streaming platforms. You can also find us at our website, which is minutewomenpodcast.ca. We have an Instagram, which is at Minute Women Podcast. Same on Facebook, and then on Twitter, we are at the Minute Women.
Yeah, and please do check out our website. It's pretty beautiful, pretty fun, pretty easy to navigate.
Please
It's got pictures of
sponsor
our
Squarespace.
faces. Yeah.
It's so
Squarespace,
easy. I
your
could use
sponsor.
it.
Okay, guys. Well, officially from North and Normal, thanks again. This was awesome to be able to
Yeah.
do.
Oh,
Yeah, 100%.
thank you.
Go clap, go clap.
North and Normal is a product of Eldritch Creative, which can be found on Facebook at Eldritch Creative and Instagram at eldritch.creative. This show can be found at North of Normal on Facebook and on Instagram at North of Normal Pod. Intro music is by Dad vs. Son out of Hamilton, Ontario. That's it for now. Be seeing you.